requires. So you may have noticed in our worship, we've begun using a land acknowledgement during our welcome to pay respects to the people who were here before European colonizers showed up and who are still here. And I want to drill down, not into that piece specifically, but I want to take us back in a bit of history to the first days of the colonization of this continent. And I want to think with you about grace and abundance and scarcity and bread. So would you pray with me? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ruach haolam osei maaseh bereshit. Blessed are you, Holy One, our God, Spirit of life, who moves throughout the universe, who each day recreates the world as on the first day. God, open our eyes this day that we may see. Open our ears that we may hear. Open our hearts and make us one with you in creativity and in love. Amen. So jump in the Wayback Machine with me, if you will, and let's go back to about 1504. When Hernan Cortés first arrived in the Americas, he was not a particularly wealthy man. He was a particularly ambitious man, like many of the Europeans who came to this continent seeking adventure, and by adventure we mean wealth and land. It's free real estate. Or that's the way they thought about it anyway. But he came not a particularly wealthy man. But by 1518, he'd acquired an estate on the island of Hispaniola. He had acquired a number of servants, to use a polite euphemism for what the indigenous people that he employed were. And he'd racked up an incredible amount of debt. Turns out that our friend Cortés liked to live beyond his means. Perhaps this is unsurprising. But come 1518, he was so deeply in debt that he'd decided he would go to the provincial government and he would ask them if he could take a group of soldiers, if he could raise an army, raise a regiment, and take them to the mainland. To treasure hunt, you know. And consequently, he went on his way with 600 men and a number of thousands of pesos from his creditors, placed against any gains he would make in the quote-unquote New World, and they landed and burned their boats as if to stake their claim. We either succeed in our adventure or we don't go back. 3 years of murder, torture, genocide later, the Aztec Empire has fallen. More than 100,000 people reportedly have died, and the great Aztec city of Tenochtitlan, one of the wonders of the world, lies in ruins. It is, in fact, one of the greatest acts of theft in human history. And you'd think, after all that much thieving, that Mr. Cortés, Senor Cortés, would finally have wealth beyond his wildest dreams. Well, the man still died a debtor. Even after raiding the gold of the Americas, even after conquering an entire civilization, the man was still deeply in debt. His creditors kept coming for him. And so, the author and anthropologist David Graeber, who wrote a fabulous book called Debt, The First 5,000 Years, observes that the colonization of the Americas has its foundations in indebtedness. Because it turns out that the King of Spain was also in debt to his creditors in places like Frankfurt in Germany or the Italian city-states. There's a huge network of constant indebtedness because we got to pay for the wars, we got to pay for those estates, and somehow we're going to have to find enough to pay off our creditors so that we can finally be free of them. And Graeber points out in his book that this is exactly the same time that the Protestant Reformation is happening in Europe. Literally, as Martin Luther is nailing his theses to a door against the Catholic Church in Wittenberg in Germany, Cortés is halfway across the world, wreaking destruction on the indigenous peoples of Latin America. And Graeber notes that the economic metaphors of our society have a way of worming their way into our religion. Because if you think about the language of so much of the history of Christianity, you'll find a lot of debt language. You will find sin as a great debt owed to God, and you will find language of forgiveness and redemption, words that, at least in their origins, referred to the remission of debts, the kind held between people. And you will find underneath all of that language a profound belief in scarcity. The idea that enough is never enough. The fear that one of these days our creditors, whether those creditors are human beings or a wrathful God, are going to come for us. Now, what does this have to do with our friends the Israelites in the desert? Well, they have just gotten themselves free. They have just been liberated from another empire, not the Spanish Empire, not European Empire, not even the Aztec Empire, but in fact, the Egyptian Empire. And in the couple of verses just prior to the ones we read in our story today from the book of Exodus, we learn that they've only been out there in the wilderness for a couple of months. The memory of their sudden, incredible exodus and liberation from Egypt is very much at the forefront of the Israelites' minds. Or at least it should be. After all, God literally just drowned their opponents and led them out of the land of slavery into the wilderness. We're not at the promised land yet, folks. We still got about 39 years and a couple of months to go. They're wandering out there, they're following the lead of Moses and Miriam and Aaron, and that's when they begin to whine. With the experience of liberation fresh in their minds, here we find our friends the Israelites, and boy, do I identify with this, complaining, once again, it would have been better if God had just killed us in the land of Egypt, because at least we had enough bread to eat. I wonder if they simply have a bad memory. I often wonder this about the Israelites. Surely it wasn't that great to be forced labor on the pyramids. I don't know. Doesn't sound very fun to me. Maybe they've got bad memories, but they're out there complaining that there won't be enough food, that God, who led them out of Egypt, would have been better to leave them there if this is all they're going to get, wandering in the wilderness with bellies rumbling. They have been set free physically. They are no longer in Egypt. They are no longer under the physical yoke of the Egyptian empire and Pharaoh. But they have not yet gotten free in here. Funny thing about the word Egypt, as it gets translated as Egypt in the Hebrew Bible, in Torah, the actual Hebrew is Mitzrayim. If you know anything about Hebrew, you might recognize, with the im ending, that's a plural. That's because it doesn't just mean Egypt, it means the narrow places. Egypt is referred to as the narrow places. Which means, according to the rabbis, according to the sages, that Egypt is not the only possible narrow place where we can be stuck. Narrow places, a place of constriction a place of scarcity, a place of not enough. And it turns out just like those reformers and just like those religious during the dawn of the modern era who imported the language of debt into their spirituality and into their theology. Turns out the Israelites have imported the Mitzrayim with them into the desert. They've taken the narrow place and brought it with them. Fearing that the God who literally just opened an ocean for them and destroyed their enemies won't be able to feed them in the wilderness. They still abide in the consciousness of empire, in the consciousness of Pharaoh, in the scarcity consciousness that has been literally beaten into them over generations. And God says, as God always does, trust in me, the Spirit of liberation. Trust in me, the Holy One, your God. I am who I am, I will be who I will be, and you will get free. There will be enough. God sends manna in the wilderness, which we learn shortly after this passage cannot be hoarded. There's only enough for one day at a time, or actually, because God is a good Jew in Torah, there's twice as much on Friday so that we can gather enough for the Sabbath. God's on top of it. God's on top of her stuff. She thinks about her people, cares about them. But you can't hoard it. There will be enough. Not more than enough. Or rather, what I should say, it's not that it's not more than enough. There may not be enough for the people's craving, but there will absolutely be enough to get them to the next day. So 1500s, in Mexico, ancient Israel in the Sinai Desert, or I should say the precursors to the Sinai Desert here, on their way to the Promised Land eventually. So what about us today? Where are our narrow places? Like the ancient Israelites, the church, and perhaps particularly those of us who believe in a liberatory, progressive, forward-moving church, a church that is in co-creative collaboration with the God of justice and freedom. I believe that we, like those early Israelites, are meant to be a model of a different kind of economy. A different kind of community. We are meant to be, as Jesus might say, the leaven that raises the whole loaf. We're meant to be an icon of how things could be, how things should be, maybe, although the word should has some interesting etymological roots in debt, so maybe we'll leave that one aside for the moment. The way God knows the world can be. And God knows the world can be an awfully abundant place. And I want to ask us as a community, do we believe that? Do you believe that? Do I believe that? If I believed deeply in my bones, in the kind of way that would lead me out into the wilderness, trusting the God who led me there, if I actually believed that there will, in fact, be enough, how would my life change? How would the things I worry about each day change? What might I be willing to do that my fear and my scarcity consciousness kept me from? If we together believe that there is enough, not necessarily to make us comfortable, not necessarily to satisfy our craving, not necessarily to satisfy our fear, but enough for our courage, enough for our call, enough for our vocation to love and serve and transform the world with God, if we actually believed that, how would we change? If we brought that imagination into our small groups and our worship and our budget and our mission and our ministries, how might we change if we actually believed in that? What might our society do? Last night, or I should say yesterday, the eviction moratorium lapsed. The federal eviction moratorium lapsed, which means that millions of Americans who have not been able to make their rent payments, who have not been able to pay off their rent debt over the course of the pandemic, in an all but unprecedented economic downturn for working people, millions are facing the prospect of being unhoused. In the richest society on earth, perhaps the richest society the world has ever seen, and yet we are looking at millions of potential new homeless folks. How would it be different? How might we organize society a little differently? What might our policies look like? What might our practices look like if we actually believed in abundance? If we actually believed that there is enough not for our greed, but for our need in the world? And how would we redirect those resources from the way that we're directing them right now? In spaceships, so that billionaires can fly to space. How would our society change if we believed in the God of abundance? Not the God of indebtedness, not the one who drives us to violence, to fear, to expropriation, not that one. Not the one we somehow have to repay but ultimately can't, because God's not in the debt repayment business. God is in the debt forgiveness business. The God of Jubilee, the God of manna, the God of the bread and the cup, which feed us and sustain us, even when we don't think we can go on, even when we are afraid for the future, even when we don't believe that we have enough, that we are enough, that we will be enough. In seminary, we often heard the maxim, God doesn't call the equipped, God equips the called. God doesn't necessarily call those who have all the resources. God makes sure that those who are truly called to the work get the resources they need to do it. Because if God can set the Israelites free and God can give manna in the wilderness, then surely God can help us find the courage, the resources, the abundance of spirit. If nothing else, the abundance of spirit, the abundance of grace to make our lives freer, to liberate us from our narrow places and the narrow places we have created for one another. So in good social critic fashion, I'm not going to leave you with a plan. I was trained as an academic. In academics, we don't plan, we critique, we describe. That's a dig. You can laugh at me, it's fine. I'm laughing at me. Of course not. But I want us to imagine, because I think that's what God wants us to imagine. I think that's what these stories are about, is opening our imagination, is broadening our vision, is getting us out of the narrow places where we live inside our own heads, inside our own hearts, and cracking us open to a world of miraculous, abundant, graceful enough. As the Bishop Yvette Flunder of our sister congregation, our cousin congregation, City of Refuge in the San Francisco Bay Area likes to say, hurt people, free people, free people. So go on and get free.